I'm terribly surprised and I'm terribly grateful to the Academy. And I'd just like to thank everyone, and I'd like to thank my two families, the Waltons and the Thomases. Thank you very, very much.
Every single night, for 9 seasons, a family on television said goodnight to each other in the dark, and millions of American households felt a little bit less alone because of it. But almost every actor who built that feeling walked away from the show at some point, some for reasons the audience never saw coming, some for reasons that had nothing to do with the cameras at all. One of them turned down a role that could have defined the rest of his career. Another carried a secret about the U.S. government that would have shocked the very viewers who adored him. And one of the most beloved mothers in television history left behind 4 Emmy Awards to save herself. This is the real story of why the Walton family, on screen and off, kept losing its people, and why so many of them found their way back anyway. The Waltons premiered on CBS in September of 1972, built around the memories of writer Earl Hamner Jr., who based the show on his own childhood in Schuyler, Virginia, during the Great Depression. It became one of the defining family dramas of the decade, a show that made a quiet farmhouse in the Blue Ridge Mountains feel like the emotional center of the country. Audiences tuned in every week not for spectacle, but for the sense that this particular family, no matter what hit them, would hold together. What almost nobody watching realized was that behind that image of permanence, the cast itself was in constant motion. Actors left the show for medical reasons, for personal reasons, for reasons they didn't fully understand themselves until years later. Understanding why they left tells you something the show itself never could, because it's a story about real people, not fictional ones. Start with the actor who was, in many ways, the heart of the entire series. Richard Thomas played John Boy Walton, the oldest son and the show's narrator, a young man with dreams of becoming a writer. Thomas was only 21 when the role began, and within a year he had already won a Primetime Emmy for the performance. By the mid-1970s, he was one of the most recognizable young actors on American television, playing a character so gentle and so specific that audiences had trouble separating the two. That recognition, though, became its own kind of pressure. Thomas had trained as a stage actor and watched peers from his generation building film careers that felt, to him, entirely out of reach as long as he stayed tied to a weekly family drama. He began to worry, quietly at first, and then more seriously, that John Boy was turning into the only role he would ever be allowed to play. By 1977, after 5 seasons, he made the decision to leave. The show wrote his exit as gracefully as it could, sending John Boy off to New York to chase his writing ambitions, which fit naturally with everything the character had always wanted. It didn't feel like a plot device. It felt like the character finally getting what he'd been reaching for the whole time. What happened next is the part of the story that rarely gets told with any honesty. Thomas worked steadily after leaving. Strong stage work, television movies, film roles through the late 70s and into the 80s. But nothing landed with the same cultural weight as John Boy had. The film career he had imagined justifying his exit never fully arrived. Meanwhile, the show had to solve a practical problem in his absence, eventually recasting the role with actor Robert Whiteman for the final 2 seasons. Whiteman handled the part professionally, but longtime viewers noticed immediately that something essential had shifted. When the Waltons began producing reunion television movies in the following decade, Thomas returned to the role, appearing alongside the surviving original cast. In interviews since, he has spoken with real candor about what that whole experience taught him, that he had underestimated what the show actually was while he was still inside it, so focused on what it might be blocking him from doing that he didn't fully appreciate what it had already given him. Leaving at the height of a show's popularity, while still in his 20s, remains one of the more honest examples in television history of how difficult it is to see clearly what you have while you're still standing inside it. Then there's the story of the man who played America's favorite grandfather, a story that has almost nothing to do with the show itself. Will Gear portrayed Grandpa Zebulon Walton from the very first episode, and to most viewers, he was simply the warm, weathered patriarch of the mountain, the man who sat on the porch and made hard times feel survivable. What audiences did not know was that long before he ever set foot on that farmhouse set, Gere had already lived through something far harder than anything written into the scripts. He had been a committed left-wing activist since the 1930s, a close friend of folk singer Woody Guthrie, and an active participant in labor and civil rights causes at a time when that kind of involvement carried real professional danger. When the House Un-American Activities Committee began investigating alleged communist influence in Hollywood, Gere's name came up, and in 1951 he was called to testify. He refused to cooperate, and the consequence was immediate. He was blacklisted, effectively shut out of film and television for more than a decade. During those years, he found whatever work he could on stage and in small theaters, while the industry he had helped build treated him as though he no longer existed. By the time the blacklist finally loosened in the 1960s and Gere found his way back into television, he was already in his late 60s. When the Waltons cast him as Grandpa Zeb in 1972, the man sitting in that rocking chair every week, telling stories about resilience and community, had lived through something that tested those exact values far more severely than any fictional storyline the writers could invent. There is a real irony in that. A show that became one of American television's great celebrations of decency and togetherness was anchored, in part, by a man who had been professionally punished for over a decade for standing up for those very principles in real life. Gere continued in the role through the show's 5th season and passed away in April of 1978, at the age of 76, during the production period. The show honored that loss by writing Grandpa Walton's death into the story between seasons rather than manufacturing an artificial farewell. Castmates spoke afterward about how deeply his absence was felt in every scene filmed without him. His political history became more widely known and more fully understood as the decades passed, and the blacklist era received the historical reckoning it deserved. He carried that chapter of his life without visible bitterness, spending his final years playing one of the most beloved grandfathers television has ever produced. Right alongside him for those same early seasons was Ellen Corby, who played Grandma Esther Walton with a sharpness and dry humor that balanced Grandpa Zeb's warmth perfectly. Corby had already been a respected character actress for decades before joining the show, with an Academy Award nomination to her name from the 1940s. She won 3 Primetime Emmy Awards for the role of Grandma Walton across the show's early seasons, a level of recognition that reflected just how precisely she had built the character. Then, in November of 1976, during production of the 5th season, Corby suffered a severe stroke. She was 66 years old, and the stroke significantly affected both her speech and her mobility. Her ability to return to the demanding pace of a weekly drama was genuinely uncertain for a while. What the show's creators did next says something meaningful about the culture behind the camera. Rather than quietly writing the character out or recasting the role, they chose to write the stroke directly into the storyline. Grandma Walton suffered a stroke on screen, and the family's response, the fear, the adjustment, the slow and incomplete recovery, became part of the show's ongoing narrative. That decision meant Corby's real situation was acknowledged rather than hidden, and her eventual return, beginning in the show's 7th season, felt earned rather than arbitrary. Her appearances were reduced from what they had been before, and the physical effects of what she had been through were visible in her performances. But the production worked around those limitations with genuine care. She continued appearing through the show's final seasons and returned again for the reunion movies. It was a small act of creative integrity, aligning what the show did behind the scenes with the values it broadcast every week. Few departures, though, carry the specific weight of Michael Learns. Learn joined the show in 1972 as Olivia Walton, the family's mother, and turned what could have been a straightforward supporting role into something far more layered, a woman who was patient and principled, and, in ways the show allowed to show through, quietly worn down by the demands of holding a family together during hard times. The industry recognized what she was doing almost immediately. Learned won the Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Lead Actress in a Drama Series for separate times across a 7-year span, a level of sustained recognition that very few performers in American television history have matched on a single show. And then, after season 7, she left anyway. The reason she has given consistently in interviews over the years is simple and completely understandable. She was exhausted. Not by the character, and not by the people she worked with. She has spoken warmly about her castmates across every decade since. But 9 or 10 months of demanding production every year for 7 consecutive seasons had worn her down in a way that 4 Emmy statuettes on a shelf couldn't offset. She wanted other work. She wanted a life not entirely consumed by a production calendar. She wanted the ability to choose. The show wrote her departure by giving Olivia Walton tuberculosis, sending the character to a sanitarium for extended treatment, a solution that preserved her dignity and left the door open for a return. She did come back for later episodes and reunion films, but the specific weight Olivia Walton had carried as the family's emotional center never fully redistributed in her absence. Something about the show's texture changed. What makes her departure worth comparing to Richard Thomas's is how different their reasons actually were. Thomas left chasing something he thought was bigger. Learned left to reclaim something the show had slowly used up. Both are legitimate reasons to walk away, but they point to 2 very different costs that a long-running, successful show can quietly extract from the people carrying it. Before Michael Learned ever set foot on that farmhouse set, though, another actress had already been cast in the role of Olivia Walton. Her name was Patricia Neal, and in 1972 she was one of the most celebrated dramatic actresses in Hollywood, having already won an Academy Award for her role in HUD nearly a decade earlier. Earl Hamner Jr. had specifically wanted her for the part, believing she had exactly the grounded, weathered quality the role demanded. But 7 years before the show began casting, Neal had survived something catastrophic. In February of 1965, while pregnant with her 5th child, she suffered 3 massive strokes in rapid succession. She was 39 years old. The strokes left her partially paralyzed and significantly affected her speech and cognitive function, launching a demanding recovery process. Her comeback was remarkable by any measure. She returned to acting and earned another Academy Award nomination just a few years later. But by the time the Waltons began casting in 1972, the specific grind of a weekly television drama, with its relentless pace and volume of dialogue, was more than her health could realistically support. She withdrew before filming began, and Michael Learned stepped into the role instead. The Waltons that generations of viewers came to know was, in that sense, built on a role that had originally belonged to someone else entirely, shaped part by a medical crisis that had nearly taken Patricia Neal's life years before a single scene was ever filmed. Neal continued working in film and television for decades afterward, proving that her talent had survived what she'd been through, even though the role that might have defined a different version of the show was never hers to play. Not every departure on the Waltons was really a departure at all. Some cast members simply walked toward the next chapter of who they already were. Cami Cotler played Elizabeth Walton, the youngest of the 7 children, across the show's entire 9-season run. She was 6 years old when it began and 15 when it ended, meaning she grew up almost entirely in front of a national audience. Most child actors coming out of a long-running series face enormous pressure to stay inside the industry that raised them. Cotler did the opposite. After the show ended in 1981, she didn't chase another role or another platform. She went to college.